The Inquisition swept like a plague across medieval Europe. It was without question one of the darkest and bloodiest episodes in human history. A time when thousands of people accused of heresy by the Catholic Church were arrested, tried, and put to death.
It was ethnic cleansing on a huge scale. It was one faith trying to exterminate another.
There were Inquisition tribunals going on all over the country. It really was a people living in fear.
This religious fanaticism spread to Tudor England, where Catholics and Protestants did their best to wipe each other out. The persecution continued in the 18th century when countless ordinary women were drowned or burned at the stake after they were accused of being witches.
1/3 of the entire population was accused of heresy and witchcraft by the other 2/3.
The Christians were actually aiming to stamp out something that had been in place for thousands of years before then. This was a war of magic and witchcraft, but what it really was a war of people that couldn't fight back.
The world lived in the shadow, Inquisition, and persecution for over 500 years. You would think we would have learned our lesson.
Thousands of heretics in this country died under the knife, the axe, or in the flames.
The horrors of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France, the persecution of the Knights Templar, and the arrest and burning at the stake of Joan of Arc. We look at all of these extraordinary stories in this episode of Inquisition.
At the end of the day, these Inquisitions were all about control and wealth. If there's an upsurgent movement, if it's religious, if it's political, they are going to be taken down because they are a threat.
The early years of the 13th century were dominated by two great religious power bases. One was the Holy Roman Empire, which controlled most of Europe. The other was the Islamic Empire, which controlled Arabia, Palestine, and southern Spain. It was a time of conflict and war between the East and the West. The Crusades to take back control of the Holy Lands from the Saracens were well underway. This was an age of boiling religious fervor, and the Holy Roman Empire was determined to rid its lands of anyone who challenged its beliefs or dared to oppose its authority. Those that did were branded as heretics. In the year 1208, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade against a radical sect of Christians based in the Languedoc area of southwest France. They were called the Cathars.
The Cathars were a bunch of way-out Christians who hung out in southwestern France at the end of the 12th century. We're talking around 1180, 1190. And their basic belief is there is a good, true God, but he didn't make the world. To them, the explanation for why the world is so screwed up is it was made by a wrong God, a lesser God, and we are his imperfect creations. So the best thing anybody can want to do is get out of the world and get up to heaven to the true God.
They didn't have a lot of belongings, they didn't own a lot of property, and they went around preaching to people, usually in pairs, and delivering that message. And people responded to that with alacrity because it was, they were approachable, they were accessible, they seemed to be embodying this idea of the early church in a way that the how should we call it, the institutional church, if you like, at that time wasn't doing. So one of the problems that the church had, and one of the reasons that they found these groups alarming, was that they presented a kind of competition.
The biggest difference between Cathars and Rome is that the Cathars had a religious belief system that they were devout to. It wasn't about profit, it wasn't about power, it was about what they believed was the purest way to reach their God.
I believe that Rome attacked the Cathars purely and simply because the Cathars were fed up with the bigotry and the greed and the terror that was being rained upon the world by the Catholic Church. They had slightly different views on religion. They didn't believe in purgatory. They didn't believe in celibacy. They hated killing. And purely and simply, the Catholic Church was starting to lose a little bit of ground, and so they decided the only way to do something about it was to slaughter them, to kill them, which is what they did, in great numbers.
Rome sent a huge army of mainly French soldiers against the Cathars. Its goal was simple: to destroy them completely and to seize their assets. It was the beginning of a brutal 20-year campaign, which was marked by the indiscriminate slaughter of thousands of innocent people. This was ethnic cleansing on a grand scale. Historian Andrew Goff has spent years researching and investigating the persecution of the Cathars and the mercenary army behind it.
It's important to remember that the Inquisition army was not a foreign force. No, they were actually comprised entirely of French troops who belonged to the barons and lords of Catholic northern France. So these northern crusaders would have been happy to come down and beat up on these southern heretics. But let me tell you the real reason for this crusade. The truth is, they wanted to acquire new lands. Their motivation was simple. They wanted to line their own pockets.
Rome's issue with the Cathars is simply that they caused a large, rich, important slice of France to declare independence from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church was getting used to heretics that usually hang out in mountain valleys or secret meetings. This is an open rebellion or the secession of a very important bit of territory from the Church. So the Pope and his friends thought about it for a moment and declared war on them.
Les armées viennent en marche. J'entends parler des rumeurs dont on confronte avec le pape et ses évêques ces jours-ci.
In July 1209, Rome's army arrived outside the hilltop city of Béziers. Its commanders demanded that the city surrender, but the Cathar-sympathizing inhabitants refused. What happened next would go down as one of medieval history's most ruthless and cruel acts. In a single day, almost the entire population of Béziers was slaughtered, and the city was razed to the ground. Contemporary sources estimated the number of dead to be at least 10,000 people. The bloody stain of the massacre at Béziers remains to this very day.
So imagine the scene. 21st of July, 1209. A huge army, some say 30,000 soldiers, amassed in the fields behind me, outside of the city walls. Inside, the 10,000 residents of Béziers are protected by only a couple hundred soldiers of the local lords and barons who are faithful to the Cathars. The bishop fears retaliation. He fears a slaughter. He attempts to negotiate. The inquisitors want him to give up the city's heretics. They give him a list of 222 people accused of heresy, mostly Cathars, but the city refuses to comply. The next day, according to reports, a skirmish breaks out between some of the Inquisition army and the local lightly armed residents of Béziers. This results in the troops storming the city en masse. Carnage is a result. Thousands of men, women, and children are slaughtered. The Cathars would refer to this as a day of butchery.
The sack of Béziers is the first great atrocity of the crusade against the Cathars, and it was utterly shocking because until now, towns change hands, but they're good bits of real estate with useful people inside, so you try not to damage them too much. What happened at Béziers was that the town was treated as though it were a non-human, non-Christian community by fellow Christians. The slaughter was just unchecked, uncontrolled. And there is a famous story that when one of the people in charge actually had scruples about the fact that regular Catholics were getting killed alongside heretics by the Crusaders, somebody else just answered, well, God will look after his own. You kill the wrong people, they're going to go to heaven. Lighten up, don't worry.
20 years later, a local historian has this account of the attack. When they discovered from the admissions of some of them that there were Catholics mingled with the heretics, they said to the abbot, "Sir, what shall we do? For we cannot distinguish between the faithful and the heretics." The abbot replied, "Kill them all, for the Lord knoweth them that are his."
News of the slaughter at Béziers quickly spread, and as a result, many other Cathar settlements simply surrendered without a fight. It seemed that their will and spirit had been broken. The next major target for the Inquisition army under General de Montfort was Carcassonne, and it was soon besieging that well-fortified city. But the siege didn't last long. Within 2 weeks, it had surrendered without a fight.
Imagine the scene. It's 12:09, the 1st of August, and every man, woman, and child is painfully aware of the fact that the last place these crusaders visited was Carnage. Only this time would be different. De Montfort had a plan. He shut down the food and water supply to the city, and within 2 weeks, there was surrender, forcing every man, woman, and child to exit the city through the gates behind them.
Rome went after the Cathars because they believed in the wrong religion. And to Rome, that's not only an insult, but it diminishes the glory of the true God. If you don't go after these guys, then you're not actually a true Christian. But they enlisted the services of thousands and thousands of greedy, landless, penniless knights and men-at-arms who wanted very much to get rich by plundering Cathar territory. And that's exactly what they did.
After the surrender of mighty Carcassonne, other Cathar towns in the region also quickly fell. Albi, Castle Nordery, Fanjo, all surrendered to Rome's army.
It's not surprising at all that Carcassonne surrendered without any scuffle whatsoever. There was no slaughter, there was no battle. What happened at Béziers sent a loud and clear message throughout the entire region. Renounce your faith or prepare to die.
The Inquisition continued to hunt down the remaining Cathars in the Languedoc region. Eventually, most sought refuge in the remote but imposing hilltop castle at Montségur. It was perched high up in the Midi-Pyrenees. It had good supply lines, and it was virtually impossible to attack.
Basically, the Cathars had been hounded, to say the least, but they got themselves a base in a place called the Château de Montségur, and they literally holed up there. It was their last bastion, for want of a better word, and they ran the Cathar church from there, and something like 10,000 troops were actually sent to besiege the chateau.
Montségur is not particularly interesting as a defensive place because it's surrounded by other mountains, so it's only good as a safe place, but it also means that it's incredibly hard to break into. And because it's quite a big mountain, the army was not able to surround it.
There was literally only hundreds there, and of course the Cathars didn't fight, they didn't kill, and there were something like 210 perfecti, as they were called, that were there, and about 100 defenders, 100 fighters. They held out for many, many months, but eventually, of course, 10,000 troops against them. They actually invaded the place, and just before they actually smashed in the walls, they gave in. They were taken out, tried, and all of them were burnt at the stake, burnt alive at the stake.
On March 16th, 1244, the remaining Cathars were led down the mountain into the pyre that was constructed by the Inquisition army. And there, they voluntarily martyred themselves in the flames.
It had taken the best part of 40 years and had claimed upwards of 50,000 lives. But the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars had finally achieved the Church of Rome's goal of clearing out what it saw as southern France's nest of heretics. It had also seized control of huge amounts of land and assets. And just as importantly, the crusade had also been the proving ground for the Church's new Holy Inquisition, which would grow both in power and reach over the coming centuries.
Beating the Cathars gave Rome a sense of how it could deal with heresy. It gave it a structure of investigation, the Inquisition, with pretty near professional interrogators who knew how to hunt down heretics and the kind of questions to ask to get them to confess. And also gave them this fallback position, that if anything went seriously wrong, they could simply declare a crusade against other sorts of Christian, as opposed to non-Christians, which had been the usual target of a crusade hitherto.
The brutal destruction of the Cathars sent shockwaves across Europe. It had proved just how powerful Rome's forces were and how far it would go to destroy what it considered to be heresy. And to Rome, a heretic was simply anyone who dared to oppose it.
The Catholic Church was terrified of anyone who had unorthodox views, which was in their eyes. I mean, anybody that was anything to do with magic, with sorcery, mediumship, science, philosophy, was all not good for the Catholic Church, to be quite honest with you.
In Rome, it was clear that the Holy Inquisition was an efficient way to do away with any challenges to its authority and doctrine. It was also a useful method for getting its hands on vast amounts of land, assets, and wealth. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull setting up a formal tribunal to eradicate heresy altogether. It was to be run by Dominican friars, and it was the beginning of what we now know as the Inquisition.
The Inquisition, as such, is a branch of the Church which is staffed by experts, and the experts are Dominican monks. They look a bit creepy to modern eyes because they wear black habits and cowls, and they are trained to be able to detect wrong belief. They're very good at doing it. They're not necessarily nasty people. If you examine the characters, some of them are really quite warm-hearted, but their sacred duty is to rescue Christians from soul-destroying beliefs.
Tribunal would work by an inquisitor or two inquisitors arriving in a region and announcing a general sermon where he would call all the populace in a town or village to hear him deliver a sermon in which he would announce his intention to carry out an inquisition. He would remind them of his powers, and he would announce a period of grace, during which time people could come to him and tell him about things that they knew about heresy, and in return receive a mitigated sentence for anything they might have done wrong.
Vous aviez été accusé du crime d'hérésie et de blasphème. Association avec les démons. et de nier la Trinité.
For those who didn't or wouldn't confess their sins, a dreadful fate lay in store. The Inquisition's prisons were bad enough, but it was torture that those accused of heresy really feared. It was an important and awful weapon for the Inquisition, and was liberally used.
Sur les noms. Donnez les noms. Jean de c'est pas Blanchefort. Je sais, c'est pas Blanchefort. Vous mentez. C'est la vérité. C'est la vérité. Je veux la vérité.
Richard Felix is an author and historian who studied torture methods through the ages. Chillingham Castle in England has an impressive collection of some of the most barbarous devices that were used by the Inquisition.
This is the torture chamber of Chillingham Castle. This is a place of terror, pain, anguish, torture, and death. There's well over 500 years' worth of European torture equipment here in this torture chamber. This hideous contraption here is the wheel. The whole idea was to break you on the wheel. They chained you onto this wheel, spread eagle, and then they cut open parts of the body with a knife, and then poured boiling lead into the wounds, just to make you suffer a little more before they broke you. The executioner had a sledgehammer, and he smashed your legs, both of them, in 2 places. And then he smashed your arms, exactly the same in 2 places, and left you there to die slowly. But if it was a kindly executioner, most of them weren't. Most of them were sadists. But if he was, then he'd smash you in the stomach. And that would probably be the end of you. A quick death.
Je veux les noms. Je veux les noms. Ta gueule et me donner les noms. Qui sont les dires avoués.
Onwards here to the strappado. This was the main implement of torture during the Inquisition. Your hands were tied behind your back. This noose was tied around your arms, and you were then hoisted up onto a beam. Huge weights were then attached to your legs, and they left you there with the weight dragging you down, stretching the arms higher and higher, waiting for you to confess to your heresy. If you didn't confess, then the executioner let you drop, but stopped it before you touched the ground, and of course the jolt would tear sinews and probably dislocate your shoulders. Then you probably would confess.
The records of the Inquisition imprisonment and torture in southern France are available to scholars today. Professor Peter Biller of York University has discovered the story of one particular man who confessed his crimes after he was subjected to the horrors of the rope and pulley.
He confessed in January 1311. There's a summary of his confession, and at the end it's noted that he committed all of these things in the year and a half before he was captured, and he did not wish to confess about these things until he was held in prison et incorda levatus aliquantulum, this is the Latin, and raised in the cord aliquantulum a little bit. So we have here the first in the Inquisition of Languedoc, the first very precise specification of a person and the fact of torture, and also the mode of torture, because this is the mode where someone's hands were tied behind their back, The rope was then thrown over a beam, and they were hauled up, and sometimes weights attached to them.
This is the Iron Maiden. This contraption here, inside, is full of spikes, and they're still here. Now, they were not designed to kill you. They were designed to torture you. Up here, there are spikes that actually pierce the eyes. Down here, there are more spikes that actually pierce the body, but not vital organs. And the whole idea was for it to be slammed shut, and for you to be tortured, and to bleed, and to confess.
Yes. C'est un hérétique. Nous savons qu'il a eu rencontre avec d'autres, mais car personne. Avouez vos péchés, vous serez torturé bien pire que ça. Avouez, ça va sauvegarder. Hein? Non, non.
Second most used bit of equipment, the rack. Basically, you were laid as this poor guy is here, on the rack. Ropes here. Your hands put through them. And then down here, exactly the same. The ropes tied around your feet. And then they would start, very gently at first, to turn the pulleys. You can almost imagine the sinews starting to stretch as you were pulled more and more.
Allez à notre tour de rouleau. Silence.
I think you have to remember that there were tens of thousands of people who were being accused right, left, and center, and most of them were innocent. I mean, there were Inquisition tribunals going on all over the country. It really was a people living in fear.
Not only were the Inquisitors hunting down heretics, they were also keen to seize their written material. They suspected that there were large numbers of secret libraries containing ancient pagan texts and manuscripts, which were considered contrary to church doctrine. In many cases, these libraries were hidden away inside monasteries and castles, as it was only the clergy and the nobility that could actually read and write.
Mostly when the Inquisition hunts books, it hunts them under people's beds or in their cellars and their rafters, hidden in their houses. But also it needs to keep an eye on monasteries, because monasteries are the libraries of the time. Really, they and cathedrals are the only places that have the storage space and the literacy to handle that. And it's a really difficult problem of what you do with a monastery library if you've got heretical books in it. I mean, do you keep them so the right kind of person can inform themselves on what these horrid heretics believed, or do you annihilate them completely so the heresy is gone for good? It's a tough question.
It was bad enough to have heretical thoughts and to be a heretic, but to actually have things written down was, of course, even worse, because it could be passed down from generation to generation. So the Inquisitors were literally hunting down books that had any text in them that was not going along the lines of the Catholic Church. Whole libraries were actually investigated, some closed down, and hundreds of books were burned.
Inquisitors do go after books, and they know perfectly well that books are forever if they're properly kept. So a heresy can lie concealed in one like an anthrax virus or something like that, and in another 100 years an impressionable person will read the book and the heresy will spring to life again. That's why going after books is rooting out heresy at the base.
With Cathar heresy largely wiped out in southern France, the Inquisition turned its attention to the Knights Templar. The Knights were a mysterious order surrounded by rumors of bizarre rituals, occult practices and peculiar beliefs, a juicy target for Rome. With the help of the French king, the Inquisition accused the Knights Templar of devil worship and of defiling the cross during their secret ceremonies. By the rules of Rome, they were heretics and therefore ripe for destruction.
Knights Templars were targeted by the Inquisition because they'd become too powerful, too mystical, and too wealthy. They were all good Christians. They were good Catholics. Hundreds of them had died in the name of God and of the Catholic Church. They were set up really as crusaders, and then ended up by guarding the roads to Jerusalem. They were doing a good job, but they'd become international bankers. They were terribly wealthy. The King of France owed them a lot of money, and it was all back to greed again. And basically, they were targeted, saying that they'd become bad Christians, they were heretics, they were practicing homosexuality, and basically, it was purely and simply greed. The King of France and the Catholic Church wanted their money.
We are gathered here one more time, one last time, before we must depart these lands. We will know what we must do. Here we shall swear, as we have done before. First, we will drink of the blood.
The Knights Templar were accused of horrific heresies. I mean, this was a pious order, and the accusations included things like spitting on the cross, worshiping idols, homosexuality. I mean, this was libelous stuff, and it was difficult to refute.
The Knights Templar were accused of all manner of atrocities against the church, including homosexuality, urinating on the cross, inverting the cross, mystical deeds. They were accused of worshipping a deity called Baphomet. They were slightly like the Freemasons in the fact that they had their own secret rituals. And basically, this was, to the Inquisitors, heresy on a grand scale.
Oh, praise Baphomet. Praise Baphomet.
The person who takes out the Knights Templar is Philip the Handsome of France, and we can never get inside his head and know why he did it. It's absolutely certain the Templars are underemployed, incredibly rich and politically powerful. So the King of France doesn't have a use for them at all, but he has a wonderful use for all their cash and their lands. We'll never know, however, whether Philip himself really believed the stories he told about the Templars. He claimed to be convinced they worshipped the devil with all sorts of hideous anti-Christian acts. And they were put on trial for that. They were tortured into confession, and the leaders were put to death. So either way, Philip the Handsome doesn't come out looking very handsome. He's either a demented religious bigot who believes in lies which no credible historian has ever endorsed, or he's utterly unscrupulous and framing a bunch of innocent people in order to steal their cash. Either way, it's a horror story.
On Friday the 13th, 1307, the French king, Philip IV, issued orders for all Knights Templar to be arrested and for their properties and assets to be seized. Hundreds of knights were put on trial for heresy. Even the Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was eventually dragged out before the public and burned at the stake in the center of Paris.
There's a delicious irony in the fact that Jacques de Molay, as he's being burned at the cross, curses the king and he curses the Pope for the way he was treated, but also the way his entire order was treated. And guess what? Within a year, they're both dead.
With the Templars now out of the way, the Inquisition carried on with its ruthless elimination of heresy throughout France. On the 4th of April 1323, hundreds of heretics were burned alive in the city of Carcassonne. the very place where the Cathars had been besieged more than 100 years before. The original notes of the Inquisitors have survived down through the centuries, and they make for fascinating, if gruesome, reading.
We actually have a contemporary account of one of these burnings here in Carcassonne. The heretics, stripped naked, were smeared on both sides with wax, and they were then fastened to high poles, from the top of which they continued to pour down burning pitch and lard, a spike fastened under the chin, preventing the excruciated victims from turning their heads to either side, so as to escape the liquid fire until their whole bodies were literally clad, encased in flame. A brutal scene, to say the least. You can imagine right here what a spectacle it would have been. And it would have served two purposes. The first, to penalize the victim for their heretical sins. But the second, to send a strong message to the hundreds and thousands of people who would have witnessed the spectacle. This is your fate too, if you are also a heretic.
It's often thought the threat of being burned is enough to get people to confess, but if you confess, you might get burned. Now, it depends where you are. In places with a regular professional inquisition, almost nobody's going to get burned. Instead, they will interrogate you again and again, compare your confessions or your refusals to confess with the statements of witnesses. It's like a court of law, a well-run court of law anywhere in the world. But if you're in a panic situation, a place that doesn't have the professionals, then they will do anything. They'll threaten to burn you unless you confess, and they'll burn you when you confess. They will make you scream and scream until you're prepared to say anything, and they'll get you to denounce the people you love best in the world.
With most of France now submitted to its will, the Inquisition was to claim one other famous victim. She was Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, who was born a peasant girl in what is now eastern France. Convinced she was blessed with divine guidance, Joan rose to lead the French army to several important victories over the English during the 100 Years' War.
Joan of Arc was a fighting woman, an Amazon, a second Boudica, which of course the English remembered. She was leading the French against us and doing very well. She was having voices from God and visions, dressing in armour like a man, and this was frowned upon. She was obviously a heroine for the French, but hated by the English, and she was known as the French Witch. And this is what they used, of course, when they captured her. She was given over by the Burgundians to the English, and they tried her as a heretic and burned her at the stake.
Well, we brought before this court in the eyes of God to answer the charge of heresy. You did take up arms against your rightful king and did appear in public dressed as a man. You also claim to have heard the voices of demons and familiars. You are hereby charged as a heretic. How plead you to these charges?
I do not recognise the authority of this court.
Silence! So there's a sort of irony here that this woman, this heroine, was obviously tried by the English as a heretic, and yet she was getting voices from somewhere, and the English wanted to get rid of her, and so the best way of doing it was to brand her a witch and a heretic and burn her at the stake.
of Arc, by the power vested in me by this court, I do declare you guilty of the charge of heresy. What say you be to the court?
Do not recognize the authority of this court!
You can be taken away to the place of execution, where you can be burned at the stake, and your ashes spread on unhallowed ground. Take them away. Come!
After her trial, Joan of Arc was dragged to the stake in the old market in Rouen, where she died slowly in the flames. Her ashes were then unceremoniously dumped into the River Seine. By the end of the 15th century, the Inquisition had ravaged most of France and northern Europe. These were now lands gripped by fear, ruthlessly controlled by the Pope and the Church in Rome, and policed by roving Inquisition tribunals supported by armed troops. Hardly a city or major town escaped a visit from the dreaded Dominicans. But if the heretics had been beaten and largely defeated, they didn't disappear altogether. They simply went underground.
The Albigensian Crusade wasn't really that successful in broad terms. It did a lot to put a dent in heresy because it just killed a lot of people. It also killed a lot of people who weren't heretics, and so it also did a lot to kind of reinforce a Southern identity.
You have to wonder if the Pope and his advisors actually said, you know, this whole crusade, this whole Inquisition, that worked really well in France. And guess what? We have upstarts in Spain. Let's do it again.
And that's exactly what they did. Emboldened by the success of their efforts in France and hungry to track down other heretics, as well as grabbing their lands and wealth, Rome began to cast its eyes further afield, to Spain. What ensued there was one of the darkest chapters of Europe's history. This was the time of the bloody Torquemada.
I really don't think you could underestimate how much the Inquisition and the tribunals affected the mindset of the people in Spain.
After the great success that the Inquisitors had in stamping out the Cathars, the Waldensians, the Albigenses, and of course the Templars, they were looking for new lands, they were looking for new money, and they turned to Spain. And two groups stood out, the Jews and the Muslims, and the Spanish Inquisition started.